Imagine standing on a muddy riverbank in central Italy. The year is somewhere around 1000 BC. The air smells of wood smoke, wet earth, and livestock. Around you, scattered clusters of reed-thatched huts sit on low hills above the floodplain. There are no marble temples here, no golden statues, no armies in shining armor marching to the beat of drums. There is nothing here to suggest that this collection of humble villages, this forgotten backwater on the edge of the ancient world, will one day birth the most powerful civilization the Western world has ever seen. And yet, from this very spot, from these hills, from this river, from this mud, something utterly extraordinary is about to emerge. The city of Rome, a city that will go on to conquer most of the known world. A city whose language will shape every major Western language spoken today. A city whose legal principles still form the foundation of law across dozens of modern nations. A city whose engineers built roads that are still in use 2,000 years later. A city so dominant, so enduring, so breathtakingly ambitious, that even long after it fell, people kept calling themselves Roman, because nothing else sounded powerful enough. But here's the question that has fascinated historians, archaeologists, and storytellers for centuries. How did it actually begin? What was the real story behind the founding of Rome? Was it a miraculous act of the gods, as the ancient Romans themselves believed? Was it the cunning work of a single violent genius? Or was it something far more complicated, the slow, messy, often brutal collision of different peoples, cultures, and ambitions playing out across generations? The truth, as we're about to discover, is stranger and more fascinating than anything a myth could invent. This is the story of how Rome began. Part 1. The World Before Rome. To understand how Rome was born, you first have to understand what Italy looked like before it existed. Because the peninsula that would eventually become the heartland of a world empire was, in the centuries before Rome's founding, a patchwork of competing peoples, languages, and cultures that had very little in common with each other. Let's go back to roughly 1200 BC. The Italian peninsula at this point is not a unified country. It never has been. It is a long, boot-shaped strip of land jutting southward into the Mediterranean Sea, and it is populated by dozens of different tribes and cultures who speak different languages, worship different gods, and live in radically different ways. In the far north, the Po Valley, that wide, fertile plain at the foot of the Alps, is home to various tribes, including the Ligurians and Celts, who have filtered down from Central Europe. These are warrior cultures, semi-nomadic in places, skilled at cattle herding and metallurgy, deeply suspicious of outsiders. Further south, along the Tyrrhenian coast, a remarkable civilization has already established itself with a sophistication that will astonish you. These are the Etruscans, and they deserve your full attention, because without understanding the Etruscans, you cannot truly understand how Rome came to be. The Etruscans are one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. Their origins are debated to this day. Some ancient writers believe they sailed from Lydia in western Turkey. Others argued they were a native Italian people who had simply developed their culture in place. Modern genetic and archaeological evidence leans toward them being indigenous to Italy, but with some Eastern Mediterranean influence absorbed through centuries of trade contact. Whatever their ultimate origin, by 900 BC, the Etruscans are already building proper cities with stone foundations, organized street plans, sophisticated drainage systems, and temples dedicated to a pantheon of gods they partly share with the Greeks. The Etruscans are extraordinary. They are skilled metalworkers who mine and smelt copper, tin, and iron from the hills of Tuscany and Umbria. Their jewelry is so intricate and beautiful that archaeologists who excavate Etruscan tombs often mistake pieces for modern forgeries because it seems impossible that anyone in 700 BC could have produced such fine goldwork. They have a written alphabet derived from the Greek alphabet, which they adopted through trade contact with Greek colonies in southern Italy. They love banquets, music, and sport. Etruscan tomb paintings show couples reclining together at feasts, musicians playing lyres and flutes, athletes competing in races. This is a society that knows how to enjoy life, and they know how to project power. By the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Etruscan city-states like Caere, Veii, Tarquinia, and Volci are wealthy and well-organized, trading with the Greeks, the Phoenicians, and cultures as far away as the Near East. Etruscan goods, fine bronze vessels, painted pottery, amber jewelry, turn up in archaeological sites across the entire Mediterranean world. These are not primitive villagers. These are sophisticated urban traders who are plugged into the most advanced commercial networks of their age. South of Etruria, down in the toe and heel of Italy's boot, a different world is taking shape. This is what the Greeks call Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, because Greek colonists have been settling along the southern Italian and Sicilian coastlines since roughly the 8th century BC. Cities like Cumae, Naples, Tarentum, and Syracuse are essentially transplanted pieces of the Greek world, bringing with them Greek religion, Greek art, Greek philosophy, and Greek commercial sophistication. The influence of these Greek colonies on the culture that eventually becomes Roman is profound and lasting. In central Italy, between the Etruscan zone to the north and the Greek zone to the south, lies a broad region of hills, rivers, and volcanic plains known as Latium, and this is where our story really begins. Part 2. The Latins. The people who live in Latium in the early Iron Age are known as the Latins, and they are, at first glance, not particularly impressive. They are a pastoral and agricultural people, farmers and herders mostly, organized into small tribal communities built around hilltop villages. They speak an Indo-European language that will eventually evolve into Latin, the language of Rome, the language of law, science, and the Christian Church throughout medieval Europe, and the parent language of French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. But in 1000 BC, that future is utterly invisible. The Latins are simply one of dozens of similar tribes dotting the Italian landscape, related by language and culture to other groups like the Sabines in the Apennine Hills to the east, the Samnites further south, and the Umbrians to the northeast. What the Latins do have is geography. Latium sits at a natural crossroads. The Tiber River, a broad, shallow waterway that drains from the Apennines to the sea, forms the northern boundary of Latium. Control the Tiber crossing, and you control trade moving north to south along the western coast of Italy. The hills of Latium, meanwhile, offer defensible high ground in a landscape that can otherwise feel uncomfortably exposed. And in the middle of all this, the hills above the Tiber's lower course offer something particularly valuable. A natural ford where the river is narrow enough to cross, protected by a cluster of steep-sided hills rising from the floodplain. 7 hills, to be precise. Hills that will one day be famous the world over. This is the site of future Rome. But in the early Iron Age, long before anyone thinks of it as a city at all. This cluster of hills is home to small, scattered communities of Latin-speaking farmers and herders who live in oval huts, raise pigs and cattle, grow emmer wheat and spelt, and worship a collection of local deities, gods of the harvest, gods of the hearth, gods of the boundary stone. Archaeological excavation of these hills, particularly the Palatine Hill, which shows the earliest signs of continuous occupation, reveals post holes and floor impressions from oval huts dating to the 10th and 9th centuries BC. Archaeologists have found traces of thatched roofs, clay hearths, simple pottery, and bronze tools. This is subsistence-level living. These people are not building a civilization. They are surviving, year by year, season by season, waiting for a world that hasn't arrived yet. But change is coming, and it's coming from the north. Part 3. The Legend of Romulus and Remus. Now here's where the story gets complicated in the most delicious way. Because the Romans themselves had a very specific idea about how their city was founded, and it had almost nothing to do with gradual agricultural development or tribal migration patterns. As far as the Romans were concerned, their city was founded by a man named Romulus, a demigod, a warrior, a king, on the 21st of April, 753 BC. And the story of how Romulus came to found that city is one of the most dramatic, violent, and frankly bizarre founding myths in all of human history. Let's tell it the way the Romans told it. It begins, as so many ancient stories do, with a prophecy and a crime. Far to the southeast of the Tiber Hills, in the Latin city of Alba Longa, the oldest and most prestigious Latin city, believed to have been founded by Aeneas's son Ascanius after the fall of Troy, there lives a king named Numitor. Numitor is old, respected, and legitimate. He is supposed to rule, but his younger brother, a cruel and ambitious man named Amulius, has other ideas. Amulius seizes the throne, drives Numitor into exile, kills Numitor's sons to prevent any challenge to his power, and then, in what he considers a masterstroke of cynical genius, forces Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal Virgin, one of the sacred priestesses dedicated to the goddess Vesta. As a Vestal, she is sworn to a life of chastity. No children, no heirs, no threat to Amulius's dynasty. It's a perfect plan, except for one small problem. The god Mars has different ideas. According to the legend, Mars, the god of war, appears to Rhea Silvia and makes her pregnant. She gives birth to twin boys. When Amulius discovers this, he is furious. He orders Rhea Silvia imprisoned and commands that the twins be thrown into the Tiber River to drown. The servant given this task, unwilling to carry out the order directly, places the babies in a basket and leaves them at the water's edge, where the flooding river carries them downstream and eventually deposits them at the foot of the Palatine Hill, near a sacred fig tree called the Ficus Ruminalis, whose exact location Romans will still point to with reverence centuries later. This is where a she-wolf finds them. The wolf, sacred animal of Mars, doesn't kill the babies. She nurses them, suckling them alongside her own cubs. A woodpecker, also sacred to Mars, brings them food. Eventually, a shepherd named Faustulus discovers the boys, takes them home, and raises them with his wife, Acca Laurentia. The twins grow up as rough, vigorous young men, leaders among the local shepherds and youths, strong, fearless, natural commanders. Their names are Romulus and Remus. Eventually, the truth of their birth comes out. Remus is captured by Amulius's men and brought before the old king Numitor, who, studying the young man's face and hearing his story, realizes that this is his grandson. Romulus raises a band of followers. The brothers reunite. They kill Amulius and restore Numitor to his rightful throne in Alba Longa. But Romulus and Remus don't want to rule someone else's city. They're young, ambitious, and full of the energy that comes from having been raised wild. They want to build something new. They want a city of their own. The brothers go to the hills above the Tiber, the very hills where they were raised, and decide to found a new city. But there is a problem. Which hill should the new city be centered on? Romulus favors the Palatine. Remus prefers the Aventine. Neither will back down. They decide to ask the gods for a sign. They will watch for birds, the ancient Roman method of divination known as augury. Remus, on the Aventine, sees 6 vultures. Then Romulus, on the Palatine, sees 12. Romulus claims victory, but Remus argues that he saw his birds first, and that should count for something. The argument turns vicious. The brothers' followers begin to fight, and then something happens that will echo through Roman history forever. Romulus begins to plow a furrow around the Palatine Hill, the sacred boundary of his new city, which he names Roma after himself. This furrow is the Pomerium, the holy city limit. Crossing it uninvited is a sacrilege. Remus, whether out of contempt, spite, or simple fraternal rivalry, jumps over the furrow with a mocking laugh. Romulus kills him. He kills his own twin brother, standing over the freshly plowed boundary of his new city, with the blood still wet in the earth. Different ancient sources tell this moment differently. Some say Romulus struck the blow himself. Others say it was one of his followers who killed Remus, perhaps in a fit of rage. But the result is the same. Rome is born in an act of fratricide. It begins with blood. And Romulus himself, according to some ancient versions of the story, reportedly says over his brother's body, "So perish whoever else shall leap over my walls." It is a chilling founding statement for a civilization that will go on to conquer the world. Part 4. What the myth is really telling us. Now here's the thing about myths. They're not meant to be taken literally. They're meant to be understood. And when you dig into the story of Romulus and Remus, what you find underneath the supernatural surface is a remarkably sophisticated attempt to explain certain uncomfortable truths about Roman civilization. The story of the Trojan connection, the idea that Romulus was descended from Aeneas, the Trojan prince who fled the burning city of Troy and eventually made his way to Italy, served a very specific political purpose. It connected Rome to the most prestigious mythological tradition in the Greek-speaking world. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were the supreme cultural touchstones of Mediterranean civilization, and any city that could claim Trojan ancestry was claiming a place in that story. The Romans were saying, in effect, "We are not barbarians, we are not latecomers, we belong to the oldest, most honored traditions of the world." The story of the she-wolf nursing the twins is equally rich with meaning. The wolf is sacred to Mars, god of war, and Romans were, above all, warriors. By making their founder literally nursed on the milk of a war god's sacred animal, they were saying, Our warlike nature is not a flaw. It is divine. It is what we were made for. The killing of Remus is perhaps the most psychologically interesting part of the myth, because it acknowledges something that most founding stories try to hide, that the creation of any political order involves violence. Cities require boundaries, boundaries require enforcement, and enforcement, ultimately, requires the willingness to use lethal force. Rome doesn't pretend this isn't true. Rome puts it right there at the very beginning of its story, in the most personal possible terms, brother killing brother, and says, yes, this is what power costs. This is what it means to build something that lasts. The Romans were remarkably clear-eyed about their own character. But was any of it historically true? Part 5. What archaeology tells us. This is the part that modern historians and archaeologists have spent the last 150 years arguing about, and the results are genuinely fascinating. The short answer is, the myth is wrong in its specific details, but surprisingly accurate in its broad outline. Let's start with the date. The Romans themselves calculated the founding of Rome as April 21st, 753 BC. This date was worked out by the Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro in the 1st century BC, using a backward calculation from various historical records, king lists, and astronomical data. It's an impressively specific claim for an event that happened over 700 years before Varro was doing his math. Modern archaeology tells a somewhat different story. Excavations on and around the Palatine Hill, conducted with increasing precision and technological sophistication throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, do show continuous occupation going back to the early Iron Age, somewhere around 900 to 800 BC. But the evidence for a sudden, dramatic founding event in 753 BC simply isn't there. What the archaeology shows, instead, is a gradual process of consolidation and growth that unfolded over centuries. The key archaeological concept here is synoikism, a Greek word that means the bringing together of households, which refers to the process by which scattered hilltop villages gradually merge into a single, unified political entity. This is what appears to have happened on the hills above the Tiber. Over the course of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the separate communities on the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Esquiline, and the other hills slowly began to develop shared institutions, shared religious spaces, and shared infrastructure. One particularly telling piece of evidence is the Forum Romanum, the great central valley between the Capitoline and the Palatine that would eventually become the beating heart of the Roman Republic. Early on, this valley was a low-lying marsh, used partly as a cemetery by the hilltop communities on either side. It was not a place where the living gathered. It was a place where the dead were buried. The transformation of this marsh from a cemetery to a public gathering space, which the archaeological evidence suggests began happening around 625 to 600 BC, is one of the key indicators that the separate hilltop communities were beginning to think of themselves as a single people with a shared public life. This is not the dramatic founding act of a single demigod. It is the slow, grinding, unglamorous work of community building, of different groups of people gradually agreeing to cooperate, to share resources, to recognize each other's customs, and to build something together. But, and this is important, the fact that Rome's founding was a process rather than an event doesn't make it any less remarkable. If anything, it makes it more so. Because what you're watching is the emergence out of the chaos and fragmentation of early Iron Age Italy of something genuinely new. A city. Not just a village, not just a hilltop fortress, but an actual urban center with all the complexity that implies. Different social classes, different ethnic groups, different economic functions, all crammed together in one place and somehow made to work. How exactly did that happen? Part 6. The role of the Etruscans. The answer leads us back to the Etruscans, because the emergence of Rome as a proper city in the late 7th and 6th centuries BC is almost certainly connected to Etruscan influence and, at least for a time, Etruscan domination. This is a fact that later Romans found deeply uncomfortable and spent considerable effort trying to minimize or deny. The image of Rome as a purely Latin creation, sprung fully formed from Latin soil under Latin hands, was central to Roman national pride. The idea that their city had been significantly shaped and for a time actually ruled by their northern neighbors was not a story Romans liked to tell about themselves. But the evidence is overwhelming. The very name of the Tiber River, Tiberus in Latin, is almost certainly Etruscan in origin. The Latin alphabet, which Rome adopted and which eventually spread throughout the entire Western world, was adapted from the Etruscan alphabet. Fundamental elements of Roman religious practice, the reading of omens in the flight of birds, augury, the reading of divine will in the entrails of sacrificed animals, haruspicy, the sacred boundary of the city, the pomerium. All of these were Etruscan practices adopted wholesale into Roman religion. Roman engineering owes a fundamental debt to Etruscan technology. The great Cloaca Maxima, the drainage system that drained the swampy valley of the Forum and made the heart of Rome habitable, was built in a period of Etruscan influence using Etruscan engineering techniques. The arch, which Roman engineers will later use to revolutionary effect in building aqueducts, bridges, and monumental architecture, was a technique mastered first by the Etruscans. Even the toga, the quintessential Roman garment, is derived from an Etruscan garment called the tabena. And then there are the Etruscan kings. According to Roman tradition, Rome was ruled by 7 kings from its founding until 509 BC, when the last king was expelled and the Republic was established. The last 3 of these kings, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, are, in the Roman tradition itself, closely connected to Etruria. Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king, is said to have been the son of a Corinthian Greek who had settled in the Etruscan city of Tarquinia. He moved to Rome as an ambitious immigrant, cultivated connections, and eventually became king. Whether these specific kings were historical individuals or legendary constructs is debated. But the broader picture they represent of Rome in the 6th century BC as a city within the Etruscan cultural and political orbit, ruled by leaders with strong Etruscan connections, being shaped by Etruscan urban culture, is strongly supported by the archaeological record. The Rome of the 6th century BC is, in many ways, an Etruscan city. Its early temples, including the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred spot in all of Rome, were built by Etruscan craftsmen in the Etruscan style, decorated with elaborate terracotta sculptures in the manner of Etruscan religious architecture. The kings of this period are associated with massive public works: the draining of the Forum, the construction of the Circus Maximus for chariot racing, the building of the city walls.
This is Etruscan-style urban development imposed on a Latin settlement. Rome, in other words, did not grow up in isolation. It grew up as part of a broader world, in contact with the Etruscans to the north, the Greeks to the south, the various Latin and Sabine tribes in its immediate neighborhood, and it absorbed something from all of them. Part 7. The Sabine Women and the Mixing of Peoples.
The myth of the founding of Rome is in fact full of stories about the mixing of different peoples. And this is one of the things that makes it so historically interesting. Because the mixing of peoples is exactly what the archaeology tells us was happening. One of the most famous stories associated with the early years of Rome under Romulus is the rape of the Sabine women. And to be clear about the language here, the word rape in this context comes from the Latin raptio, which means abduction, not sexual violence, though the story certainly involves an act of coercion. The details are as follows. Romulus, having founded his city, quickly runs into a problem. He has followers, many of them men from other communities, including, in some versions of the story, runaway slaves, exiles, and outlaws, who flock to the new settlement precisely because it offers a fresh start without questions asked. But he doesn't have enough women to sustain a population. The neighboring tribes, knowing this, refuse to intermarry with the Romans, partly out of snobbery, partly out of a sensible caution about getting too close to a city full of desperate young men with swords. So Romulus throws a festival, the Consualia, in honor of the god Consus, and invites the neighboring peoples, including particularly the Sabines from the hills to the northeast. When the guests arrive and settle in to watch the games, Romulus gives a signal, and his men seize the unmarried Sabine women and carry them off into the city. There is a war, of course. There has to be. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, leads an army against Rome, and for a time the fighting is fierce. But then the Sabine women, who by this point have been living in Rome, some of them now married to Roman men, and in some cases mothers of Roman children, intervene. They rush onto the battlefield between the two armies, pleading for peace, arguing that they have no wish to see either their fathers and brothers or their husbands killed. The two peoples make peace. They merge. The Romans and Sabines, according to the legend, become one people. It's a remarkable story to put at the foundation of your civilization's mythology. What it says, on one level, is, we began as outsiders. We began as people without a place in the existing order. We had to take what we needed and fight for everything. But we also had the wisdom, in the end, to make peace and build something together. And again, the myth is reflecting a historical reality. The early Latin communities of the Tiber Hills were indeed in close contact with the Sabines, the tribe that lived in the Apennine highlands immediately to the east of Latium. Place name evidence, linguistic evidence, and archaeological evidence all suggest that the population of early Rome was a genuinely mixed group with significant Sabine as well as Latin elements. Some ancient sources even identify specific elements of early Roman religious practice, including the worship of certain deities and certain priestly offices, as specifically Sabine contributions to Roman culture. Rome, from its very earliest days, was a city of immigrants and mixtures. This would remain one of its defining characteristics throughout its history. Part 8. The Seven Hills, the City Walls, and the Growing Settlement. Let's pause here and try to picture what Rome actually looked like in those first centuries of its existence. because the physical reality of early Rome is very different from the gleaming marble city that most people imagine when they hear the name. Early Rome, from roughly the 8th to the 6th century BC, is a collection of hilltop villages connected by footpaths, surrounded by marshes and dense oak forest, and dominated by the constant smell of wood smoke, livestock, and river mud. The famous 7 hills, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, the Esquiline, the Viminal, the Quirinal, and the Caelian, are not the gentle rises of a manicured landscape. In the Iron Age, they are steep, difficult terrain, covered in dense vegetation, separated by valleys that flood regularly from the Tiber. The Palatine is the earliest settled of the 7 hills, and for good reason. It is steep enough to be defensible, close enough to the river to provide easy water access, and positioned right at the natural ford across the Tiber, the strategic location that would determine so much of Rome's future. The earliest huts here date to around 900 BC, and the tradition that this was where Romulus built his house, the Casa Romuli, or House of Romulus, persisted well into the imperial period. Roman emperors as late as Augustus maintained the hut in an artificially preserved state as a kind of sacred historical monument, regularly rethatching its roof to keep it from rotting away. As the settlement grew and the hilltop communities began to coalesce, the valleys between the hills, particularly the great valley between the Palatine and the Capitoline, were gradually reclaimed. The drainage of the marshes, accomplished by the great underground channel of the Cloaca Maxima, is one of the engineering achievements that makes this possible. Once the central valley is drained, it becomes the Forum, the open public space that will serve as the political, religious, and commercial heart of the city for the next 1,000 years. The Capitoline Hill, though smaller and steeper than the Palatine, becomes the religious center of the city. This is where the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter the best and greatest, is built. Its pediment decorated with Etruscan terracotta figures, its cult statue made by an Etruscan sculptor named Vulca of Veii, who is reportedly the only foreign artist ever commissioned to make a statue for the Romans. The Capitoline is where Rome's relationship with its gods is centered, and where triumphing generals will eventually make their way at the end of their processions through the city. By the late 6th century BC, Rome has city walls, or at least substantial defensive earthworks. Archaeological evidence suggests significant fortification work was done in this period, protecting the growing urban area from the raids and wars that were a constant feature of early Italian life. The traditional attribution of these walls to King Servius Tullius has been partially confirmed by archaeology. There is indeed early wall construction on the eastern approach to the city, dating to roughly this period. Though the famous Servian Wall, visible today in Rome, is actually a later reconstruction, built after the Gallic sack of 390 BC. What is clear is that by the end of the regal period, by the end of the 6th century BC, Rome is already a real city. Not a village, not a collection of huts, but a genuine urban center with a population that may have reached 20,000 to 30,000 people. This makes it, by the standards of early Iron Age Central Italy, a truly significant place. Part 9. The Roman Kings: History, Legend, and Politics. The Roman tradition lists 7 kings, beginning with Romulus and ending with Tarquinius Superbus, the proud Tarquin, whose expulsion in 509 BC traditionally marks the end of the monarchy and the beginning of the Republic. These 7 kings are, to varying degrees, historical figures embedded in legendary accounts that have been substantially shaped by later tradition.
The historical reality of each one is debated, but the overall picture they present of Rome evolving from a warrior chieftainship through increasingly sophisticated forms of governance is credible.
After Romulus comes Numa Pompilius, who in the tradition is a Sabine, significant given what we've discussed about the mixing of Latin and Sabine populations in early Rome. Numa is presented as the great religious organizer of the Roman state, the king who establishes the priestly colleges, the calendar, the religious festivals, and much of the ritual infrastructure that will define Roman religion for centuries. Numa's reign is traditionally one of peace, a deliberate contrast to the warlike Romulus, suggesting that the tradition is trying to say something about the two essential foundations of Roman civilization: military power on one hand, religious and civic order on the other. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, is a warrior king, the one who, in the tradition, destroys Alba Longa itself, Rome's mother city, absorbing its population into Rome and making Rome definitively the dominant Latin city. Whether this actually happened as described is uncertain, but the tradition clearly reflects a period of expansion and conflict in which Rome was asserting dominance over the other Latin communities. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, is associated with the expansion of the city to the Tiber mouth, the founding of the port city of Ostia, which will eventually become Rome's lifeline to the wider Mediterranean world. The fifth, sixth, and seventh kings, the Tarquins and Servius Tullius, represent the period of Etruscan influence, urban development, and ultimately, royal tyranny that ends with the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus and the founding of the Republic. But here's a detail that most people miss about this whole king list. Something that reveals just how sophisticated Roman political thinking was, even in the early period. In the Roman tradition, the kings are not hereditary monarchs in the modern sense. The kingship does not automatically pass from father to son. Instead, after each king's death, the Senate, the body of senior men who advise the king and represent the leading families of the city, appoints an interrex, a temporary ruler, who oversees the selection of the next king. The people of Rome then vote to approve or reject the Senate's choice, and the gods give their assent through augury. This is a remarkably nuanced system. It combines monarchic executive power with aristocratic advisory authority and popular consent. Even in the Age of Kings, Rome is developing the instinct for the balance of powers that will eventually define the Republic. Part 10. The Daily Life of Early Rome. History tends to focus on kings and battles and founding myths, but the real texture of life in early Rome belongs to people whose names we will never know: the farmers, craftsmen, merchants, slaves, and priests, who made up the overwhelming majority of the city's population. For most Romans in the early period, life centers on agriculture. Even as Rome becomes more urban, it retains its agricultural soul. Roman citizens are classified not by birth or wealth in abstract terms, but by their property, and the most honored property is land. The Roman ideal of the citizen farmer, the man who works his own fields with his own hands and is ready to pick up his weapons to defend the community when called, is not just a myth. It reflects the actual social structure of early Rome, where citizenship and land ownership are intimately connected. The farming year in early Latium follows the rhythms of the Mediterranean climate. Grain sowing in the autumn, tending through the winter, harvest in early summer, then the long, dry summer during which other tasks, maintenance, construction, herding, dominate. Emmer wheat and spelt are the main grain crops. Olives and grapevines are beginning to appear in the archaeological record from the 7th century BC onward. Livestock, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, provide meat, milk, wool, and the ox power needed to work the heavy Italian clay soils. Early Roman houses, even in the city itself, are modest affairs. The typical early Roman dwelling is a single-room or two-room structure built of wattle and daub, a framework of woven branches plastered with clay, with a thatched roof and a central hearth. There is little furniture. People sleep on simple bed frames or on the floor. Cooking is done over the open hearth. Light comes from oil lamps made of simple clay. But even in these humble circumstances, the Romans maintain an elaborate system of religious observance. The lares, the guardian spirits of the household, are honored at a small household shrine. The penates, spirits of the household's food stores, are propitiated with daily offerings. Janus, the two-faced god of doorways and transitions, is invoked every morning. The Vestal virgins tend the sacred flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, in the forum, a flame that is understood to be identical in some mystical sense with the fire on every hearth in every Roman home. Roman religion is not an external imposition. It is woven into every moment of daily life. Social life in early Rome is organized around the family, but not just the nuclear family as we understand it. The Roman familia is an extended unit centered on the paterfamilias, the senior male of the household, who holds what Roman law calls patria potestas, the power of the father. This is an almost absolute authority. In early Roman law, the paterfamilias has the legal right to control the lives of his children, his slaves, and all dependents within his household. In theory, he can even put them to death, though this extreme power is rarely exercised in practice and becomes increasingly restricted as Roman law develops. Above the family level, early Roman society is organized into larger groupings. Gentes, singular, gens, which are clans of families claiming descent from a common ancestor. Curiae, which are assembly units for voting and military organization. And tribes. These groupings create a complex web of social obligations, loyalties, and identities that defines where a Roman stands in the world. And standing matters enormously in early Rome. The distinction between patricians, the small number of aristocratic families who claim ancestral right to certain religious offices, political positions, and social privileges, and plebeians, the great majority of free Romans who don't, is one of the defining tensions of early Roman history. This tension will eventually produce the conflict of the orders, one of the most important political dramas in the early Republican period. Part 11. Rome and its neighbors. Alliance, rivalry, and war. The Rome of the regal period does not exist in isolation. It is constantly interacting, trading, fighting, allying, competing with a crowded landscape of neighboring powers. And understanding these relationships is crucial to understanding how Rome grew. The nearest neighbors are the other Latin communities, towns like Lavinium, Tusculum, Praeneste, Tiber, and dozens of others scattered across the Latin plain and the Alban hills. These communities share language, culture, and many religious practices with Rome, but they are politically independent and often competitive. The Latin League, a loose association of Latin communities organized around common religious festivals, particularly the Feriae Latinae, celebrated on the Alban Mount, provides some structure for this Latin world, but it is not a government. It is a religious and diplomatic framework that coexists with constant local rivalry and occasional warfare. Rome's relationship with the Etruscans to the north is complicated and critically important. The Etruscan city of Veii sits just 15 kilometers from Rome on the opposite bank of the Tiber, close enough that the two cities can essentially see each other's smoke on clear days. Veii and Rome will be intermittent enemies for centuries, their rivalry culminating eventually in the Great 10-Year War of 406 to 396 BC that ends with Rome's capture and destruction of Veii. But in the regal period, the relationship is more ambiguous, commercial, cultural, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative. The Sabines in the Apennine Hills to the east are both neighbors and, as we've seen, contributors to Rome's own population. The Equi and Volsci, tribal peoples who occupy territory to the east and south of Latium, will be persistent enemies in the early Republican period. But in the regal period, they are simply part of the complicated landscape of central Italian politics. What makes Rome distinctive in this crowded landscape is not any particular military advantage in the early period, not any superior technology, not any unique cultural trait, but rather its geographic position and, increasingly, its institutional flexibility. Rome, unlike many of its neighbors, develops a consistent habit of incorporating defeated enemies rather than simply destroying or enslaving them. The absorption of the Albans after the destruction of Alba Longa, the incorporation of Sabine elements into the Roman citizenry, the gradual extension of Roman citizenship to conquered peoples. These practices build Rome's population and military manpower in ways that more exclusive city-states cannot match. Part 12. The End of the Monarchy and the Birth of the Republic. And so we arrive at the end of the regal period, and one of the most dramatic moments in all of Roman history. The last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, rules not by legitimate succession, but by murder. He kills his predecessor, King Servius Tullius, and seizes the throne by force. He rules with what the Roman tradition describes as naked tyranny, ignoring the Senate, refusing to observe traditional religious practices, executing opponents without trial, building his grand temple on the Capitoline through the forced labor of Roman citizens. He is, in other words, every Roman's nightmare of what a ruler should not be. And his fall comes through an act of family violence that has become one of the most famous stories in Western culture. Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, commits a crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia, a woman famous for her virtue, the wife of a Roman nobleman named Tarquinius Collatinus. Lucretia, after the assault, calls her father and husband to her side, tells them what has happened, and then, refusing to live with the shame imposed on her, takes her own life. Her death is the spark that ignites the revolution. Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who has concealed his intelligence behind a facade of harmless stupidity precisely to survive under Tarquin's tyranny, takes Lucretia's bloody knife and leads the Roman people in expelling the entire Tarquin family. The Senate declares the kingship abolished. A new form of government is established. 2 elected magistrates called consuls, holding equal power, serving 1-year terms, checking each other's authority. The Roman Republic is born. The year, according to Roman tradition, is 509 BC. And with that, the next chapter of Rome's extraordinary story begins. Part 13. The mysteries we still haven't solved. Before we close this chapter of Rome's history, it's worth pausing on some of the things we genuinely still don't know, because the mysteries of Rome's founding are, in many ways, as fascinating as the facts. We don't know with certainty what language or languages were spoken in Rome in the very earliest period. Latin is clearly dominant by the historical period, but early inscriptions from Rome show influence from Etruscan, Phalascan, and possibly other languages, and the population of early Rome was almost certainly multilingual. We don't know whether Romulus was a historical figure in any sense, or a complete myth, or something in between, a legendary memory of a real process of political unification personified into a single founding figure. The fact that the Romans themselves seem to have had doubts about this is suggested by the strange story of Romulus's death. He simply disappears in a thunderstorm while reviewing his troops in the Campus Martius. Some said the senators had secretly murdered him and chopped his body into pieces, each member of the Senate hiding a piece under his toga and smuggling it out. The Romans themselves couldn't fully believe their founder had died a natural death. We don't know the true nature of the Etruscan-Roman relationship in the regal period, whether Etruscan kings literally ruled Rome or whether the Etruscan influence came through trade, cultural contact, and the immigration of Etruscan individuals and families without any formal political domination. The debate continues among scholars. And we don't know exactly why Rome, out of all the Latin and Etruscan and Italic communities of early Italy, was the one that grew into an empire. Was it geography? Was it institutional design? Was it some quality in the Roman character, that combination of pragmatism, flexibility, and ferocious competitive energy that the Romans themselves called virtus? Was it luck? Probably it was all of these things together, in a combination that happened to produce something unprecedented. The Romans themselves believed their greatness was destined, written by the gods into the very foundation of their city, stamped in by the wolf's milk and the divine blood of Mars. Modern historians are more cautious, but even the most rigorous secular historian has to admit that there is something genuinely remarkable about Rome. That the chain of events set in motion by those first Iron Age farmers on the Palatine Hill produced, over the course of 1,000 years, a civilization of extraordinary power, creativity, and durability. Conclusion. The city on the threshold. So here we are. We've walked through the world before Rome existed, through the Etruscan cities and the Latin villages, through the Greek colonies of the south and the tribal peoples of the mountains. We've sat with the legend of Romulus and Remus and picked it apart to find the historical truths buried beneath the supernatural surface. We've followed the slow, messy, fascinating process by which a cluster of hilltop villages became a city. A real city, with walls and temples and drainage systems, and a public square where citizens gathered to vote and argue and worship. And we've seen that Rome, from its very first moments, was never a simple thing. It was always a mixture, always an argument, always a negotiation between different groups, different ethnicities, different classes, different visions of what this city should be and who it should belong to. That argument is about to get much bigger Because the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus in 509 BC is not just the end of the monarchy, it is the beginning of one of the most complex and dramatic political experiments in all of human history, the Roman Republic. A system of governance so sophisticated, so carefully balanced, so brutally pragmatic, that its echoes can still be heard in the constitutions of modern democracies, including, not incidentally, the United States of America. The Founding Fathers knew their Roman history. When they sat down to design the American system of government with its elected executives, its legislative bodies, its checks and balances, its written laws, they were self-consciously drawing on Roman models. The Senate, the veto, the concept of the citizen soldier, the ideal of republican virtue, all of these came directly from Rome. Which means that understanding Rome is not just an exercise in ancient history, it is, in a very direct and practical sense, understanding where we come from.
And the Republic? The Republic is where things get truly extraordinary. We've seen a city born. Now we're about to watch it grow up. How did a city-state of perhaps 30,000 people on the banks of a minor Italian river transform itself in the space of just a few centuries into the dominant power in the Mediterranean world? How did the Roman Republic develop its extraordinary military machine? How did it manage its relations with allies, subjects, and enemies across an ever-expanding geography? How did its political system, brilliant and innovative as it was, contain within itself the seeds of its own eventual destruction? Those questions, and 100 others, are waiting in the next episode. The Republic has just been born, and the world, whether it knows it yet or not, is about to change forever.